G'day, welcome to Lunch Money, where workouts and special situations experts give us their views on the news of the week. My name's Samios, I'm the Director of Hermes Capital, and I'm your host, so once again, welcome. Every week we have panellists from the corporate restructuring sector. We like to mix things up a little bit by bringing in industry specialists and sometimes professionals from parallel professions. To make things a little bit more interesting. So today we're hoping to get hold of Mark Jason, who is from Link Business, to give us a bit of a perspective on buying and selling businesses. You can imagine that his world's been tipped upside down lately. We just might drop back to Arnie, our other guest from Adelaide, Arnie Narayan. So Arnie, you're from Travancore Legal, and obviously you're in Adelaide there. You're doing a lot in the restructuring space. What's been keeping you busy?
Thanks very much for the invite, Nick. A dairy farm in near Warrnambool in Victoria,
right?
And a question about the rights of insolvency practitioners and valuers and those advising them on their right of movement between the states and whether they fit within the definition of an essential traveller.
So the farm's in Victoria, Warrnambool, Victoria, isn't it? Is that right?
Crossing between, in this case, the South Australian border and the Victorian border.
Right.
Our rules here require that if you come into South Australia from interstate, unless you've got an exemption, you're required to self-isolate for 14 days. But there's an exception to that, and that exception is if you are classified as a essential traveller. So, for example, fly-in, fly-out people in the mining sector have got a broad-based exemption from that requirement to quarantine. Plus, also nurses, doctors. The more usual type of people that we would think to be essential workers. The question really is to what extent IPs and their advisors might fit into that, and there is a little category in terms of people involved in business restructuring or business thing, and so the question becomes, how malleable a concept is it to try and get a valuer or a insolvency practitioner within that definition? You either quarantine or you don't, depending on the assessment you make.
Well, what other sort of challenges have you been facing? Specific to the restructuring space. What when your phone rings, what are the common questions in the last couple of weeks?
One thing that has been top of mind for lots of people, and I've had cause to look at it specifically this week, is the impact of the COVID-19 regulations for commercial tenancies.
Mm-hmm.
Now you might remember that way back on the 7th of April, the federal government passed a thing called the National Cabinet Mandatory Code of Conduct for Small and Medium Enterprises, Commercial Leasing Principles.
Right. Okay.
And
rolls off the tongue.
So, unfortunately, for a long time, it wasn't entirely clear whether the code was actually either mandatory or, in fact, the law, a code, because the application of it was left to each state. Commercial leasing generally being considered a matter for state by state regulation.
Right.
So certainly in South Australia, we had a bit of a false start with the legislation. A legislation came in. A set of regulations were passed under that legislation, called the Commercial Leases Number 1 regulations. Right. They were then repealed, and the Commercial Leases Number 2 regulations are in force and have been there since about the 15th of May. The framework is better in place now, and largely attempts to reflect the intentions behind the mandatory code.
Okay, well, we might come back to some of that stuff now. Thanks, Arnie. We're going to put you on hold, and we're going to introduce Mark Jason. G'day, Mark. How you going?
Yeah, really well, mate. Sorry, I was a little bit late there.
No, that's okay. You're just perfectly on time. That was really well done. So you missed where I introduced you earlier on, and I said that you're obviously in the business of bringing buyers and sellers of businesses together. You're the managing director of Link for Australia. And I know that when all this started happening, we caught up for a cup of coffee, and your world was pretty much turned upside down. So what's been keeping you busy the last couple of weeks?
Well, we lost. I think it was somewhere close to $100 million worth of deals at the time. I think we had one hospitality group that was predominantly leasehold, $35 million transaction on the table, which completely disappeared. And
35 million.
They've knocked 450 staff on the head. But what's been interesting, and I was listening to your previous commentator on the retail leases, is a lot of the shopping centres have been fantastic with their tenants on that, and I've heard some pretty good feedback both from franchisees, tenants, and also leasing agents on what they've been giving. So I've got a good inside run on what's been happening there. But our website has actually broken records the last 3 weeks as unemployment's gone up. Wow. We've had more traffic and more inquiries last week than we ever had in the 21-year history of Link.
All right, and just briefly, what do you attribute that to?
Unemployment.
Right. People are looking to buy jobs.
Yeah, 100%.
And so people are in funds to be able to buy a business, or they're just trying to suss it out for the first time, do you think?
I think there's going to be a lot of education out there, and certainly they're sussing it out for the first time. Yeah. Banks are still tight after the Royal Commission, and we're having a look at second-tier lenders, where we're still looking at asset-backed finance, whether it's equipment or whether it's your property, your home.
Sure. Yeah.
And then there's a few other options out there. So finance will still be hard, but I've been at this game now for 16 years, and my family's been in it for 30. We've seen quite a few downturns, and whenever unemployment goes up, inquiries go up and sales go up.
Fantastic. All right. Okay, Mark and Arnie, we've got here these headlines. We've pulled 3 headlines together here. Carnage when money go round stops. WA warns against a hard ending to the JobKeeper, and a longer JobKeeper will keep people in fake jobs. Now, I guess the gist of this is, we're all wondering when JobKeeper is going to come to an end, and when it comes to an end, are people going to just come bouncing back? Are they going to come back and shut their businesses, or are they going to maybe look at restructuring? What are your thoughts, Arnie?
I think one needs to be careful in making too many hard and fast comments about JobKeeper. It's clearly served the role that it was intended to do, which was to get a whole flow of money out into the marketplace. And so, to the extent that was the policy objective, I think it's been successful. Where it becomes difficult is the phase that we're in at the moment, which is about a month into it, and what's going to happen in the next 5 months that the life of JobKeeper will go for. And of course, you've got issues of moral hazard and other things that come up with it, because there could be businesses which have been given an artificial lifeline, and perhaps really should have faced the consequence of their performance earlier in the piece, but that's been taken down the track. Against that, we've got obviously the requirement to do the right thing by as many Australians, particularly those who are in the more exposed sectors such as retail, hospitality, and travel. So it's a very difficult one, and I think we're just seeing it sort of unroll at the moment, and where it will all wash out, I think we'll know in the next month or so.
Okay, and Mark, in your world, is JobKeeper itself, people waiting for that to finish before they transact on business sales, or how's it affecting the way people are approaching the buying and selling of their businesses?
Yeah, look, great question. I think there's certainly going to be a number of people that are just sitting on their hands at the moment with JobKeeper and the like. There was a lot of retailers that people deemed lazy retailers that had gone bust in January and in the year before that. And I think that with the increased unemployment, there will be less discretionary spending. And those who still do have a job will be more cautious about where they spend their money. And there's going to need to be a very sharp offering from people, from retailers, if people are going to choose to spend their money with those retailers, whether it's food or otherwise. And
Right.
so I think at the end of JobKeeper, there will be quite a number of businesses that just are not viable anymore, whether it's due to the social distancing regulations within their establishments or whether it's due to the reduced discretionary spending in the marketplace as a whole.
Right. Let's go to the next one. Okay. So now this is an interesting one. We've got two headlines that I've put together here. One is that the value of loan deferrals supposedly has hit $250 billion. Obviously, JobKeeper is one thing. Businesses are getting cash. They're getting cash coming into the business, courtesy of JobKeeper, but they're keeping cash inside the business with these loan deferrals, and they've hit $250 billion apparently. But another interesting thing reported in the paper here is that the government's loan scheme, where they'd set aside $40 billion, only $1.4 billion has been accessed on this. What are your thoughts there, Mark? You're shaking your head.
Yeah, I was amazed to see that, and I haven't read that headline. I'm busy working on some of my own stuff and pivoting in my own business. But that's very interesting. There's only 1.4 billion taken up. There's at the end of the day, I would suspect that a lot of people are realising that they're still going to be on the hook for half of that loan, and that probably shows some real concern by the SME business owner that whether or not there's going to be a lasting effect to Corona, because otherwise they would back themselves out of this issue.
Yeah, well, that's I guess. Well, there's a couple of things. Firstly, the borrower is on the hook for it 100%. The bank is only on the hook for it 50%. But I do understand that part of the issue has been that there's been some delays with banks processing these things. You can imagine they've had to instigate new processes to manage this sort of thing. The other thing is that when it first was announced, people thought that it was just free money. And when they found out that they had to pay it back again, they lost a little bit of enthusiasm. What are your thoughts, Arnie, on this? I mean, firstly, on the fact that let's break it into two parts. Firstly, there are $250 billion worth of loan deferrals. That comes off, I guess, in around September. What are people saying in your circles about this?
Well, what's interesting for me is the differential treatment between loan deferrals and rental treatment in terms of commercial property. In the space of money, we're talking about deferrals. In other words, it's putting off the evil day when the loan has to be paid back. Whereas certainly the way the regulations came here in terms of commercial leases, we're talking about both rent deferral and rent waiver, which is a markedly different thing. And one of the worrying aspects, certainly, of the regulations as they've been passed in South Australia, is that if the threshold is met by a tenant to qualify them for relief under the regulations, then the court, in looking at it, has to waive at least 50% of the rental payable.
Wow.
So not defer it. It's got to waive it, and it's got to waive at least 50%. I'm not sure if that formulation of words has been picked up in other states and territories, but I mean that's quite a chilling position, certainly as far as the commercial landlords that I've been advising. Right. And you can be sure that that we're mindful of getting tenants stitched up in terms of waivers as opposed to deferrals pretty quickly. So to me, it's interesting that difference in approach has been taken.
I think there's a fundamental difference between a mortgage holiday and a rent, because if you've got a site that's producing a smaller revenue, you've still got your overheads to pay. Whereas if you've got a deferral on your loan, there's no ongoing running costs of that mortgage as such, other than the interest. And what I'm seeing is that a lot of some good landlords are deferring that loan until such a time as the tenant's revenue reaches 105% of its previous totals. And so they're actually helping out substantially, where there may never be a payback, or it may be very long way down the track. And I'm seeing other landlords that are abating more than the minimum of 50%. However, there is a stock standard response of it's going to be 50%.
So that's on the one hand, obviously loan deferrals and rent deferral and that sort of thing. Turning to the other side of the equation there, on the loan scheme only being adopted to 1.4 billion versus 40 billion that's been set aside. Certainly what I'm hearing is that you've got to qualify for these things. The banks are still applying their regular standards, so they're not just giving it away.
And they're not giving it to new customers either. You've got to be a standing customer with a line of credit of some sort, from my understanding.
That's right. Yeah. Look, I think you're right. Though, Mark. The other thing is that debt's debt, and people it does reflect to some extent the uncertainty of what's on the other side of this. All right, we'll have a look at the next one.
Can I just chime in with one thing on that?
Yeah, sure.
Mark, Nick. It's just that that headline seems to be indicative of perhaps a bit of overestimation at a policy level. Now we saw that obviously with this the so-called $60 billion error, which I actually don't see that as much of an error, to be honest. But that's supposed $60 billion error, but it's reflective of the overestimation that was taken in by Treasury. And I think this undersubscription on the loan deferrals might be a similar factor.
Well, look, I think you could be right. I mean, of course, when this coronavirus hit, we all thought that it was going to be like an apocalyptic. We were going to suddenly end up in a zombie movie. And I think that, obviously we've responded to very well, and who knows why exactly. I think we've got good climate and a whole bunch of stuff in Australia as to why we weren't hit as badly as other people. But yeah, they did overestimate, and that does to some extent segue into this piece that we have here. This is the Reserve Bank's governor. The headline here is that he fears red tape will smother recovery. But there are some other interesting points that he makes. Firstly, that we are doing much better than expected. He refers in this article, I'm not sure if this was a speech he gave or something, but this article certainly refers to, he also had said that, the $60 billion, we should keep that up our sleeve as dry powder for maybe some other bits and pieces. Calls on the need for a bit of IR reform. But I guess, Mark, let's just stick with the headline. In your world, what regulations, if you had a magic wand, what regulations would you like to see waived to make business transactions a bit easier?
Business transactions easier. Look, I think the biggest hurdle that we've had over the last couple of years has been the availability of finance. The banks are very much set on an asset-backed finance lending model. When APRA hit investor loans about 2 years ago, it had a massive impact on the business sales environment, because most of the business sales loans, or at least a portion of them, were backed by assets. And so it crushed a lot of the business loans at the time. And when the current government got in, they talked a lot about freeing up finance for businesses and for SME loans, but we really haven't seen anything come through there. It's not like a lot of other countries where they do have some quality cash flow financing available.
There is this responsible lending legislation that came in the last financial crisis. And, if you've got someone who's just buying a business for the first time, they're willing to put up their house and risk their personal assets. And if you ask me, that's their call as adults if they feel like doing that. But of course, the banks, under that legislation, the banks are expected to nursemaid them and hold their hands. What do you think, Arnie? What sort of regulations do you think would get in the way, or what would you like to see out of the way to help a speedier recovery?
Oh, I'd echo the sort of things that both you and Mark have been talking about in terms of making capital more readily available, and just not putting so many impediments between the deal and the execution of the deal. I think I fully support the observations you've made. Can I just have a look at this headline, maybe from a slightly different perspective, that of a commercial lawyer and insolvency lawyer, and one of the things that might be described as consistent with getting rid of red tape and making business transactions easier in the current environment was those changes that the government brought in terms of the moratorium, as it were, on insolvent trading by directors, and also the extension of the statutory period for winding up applications and bankruptcy notices from 21 days to 6 months. Now, you see that on one view of it, you might say, well, that's a good step in terms of lowering red tape and making it easier for people to stay in business. But against that, on the other side of it, it's arguable, again, going back to this concept of moral hazard, is a step that's intended to make business survival better, ultimately going to result in bad outcomes, after September when these moratoriums are come off. So it's like all these things. It's a balancing act between finding ways to smooth transactions and also making sure that certain fundamentals are maintained. I don't think that there's any easy answer, and I certainly not volunteering to be a policy writer on any of this, but they're the two sides of the coin.
You touched on industrial relations, and there's been a lot of brand bashing over the last couple of years in relation to paying fair wages. And, whether it's George Calombaris going out of business, or whether it's been Domino's or Coles or Woolworths, literally every brand out there has been hit with a headline in the papers about underpayment of wages. And I think what we're finding is most of them relate to overtime and weekend loading. And I think there needs to be some reform there if these businesses are going to be sustainable and recover.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's an interesting point and a good point. I wonder, just winding back a little bit to something Arnie just said. So when you sort of mount it up, you've got the moratoriums coming off in terms of the statutory demands and what have you. You've got the holiday period, or whatever you want to call it, the debt moratoriums coming off. You've got JobKeeper coming off. I mean, it does. I was talking to someone in one of the large banks yesterday, and they are expecting strong headwinds in around September. I've spoken to other people that are saying that the strong headwinds won't hit us until next year. What do you reckon, Arnie? I mean, are you sort of tooling up for a big September, or do you think it'll be later on, or are you a bit like me and giving up trying to predict?
There's a wise proverb about those who predict don't know. I won't try and quote it, but it's about the dangers of predicting. So I'll avoid that. I think realistically, though, that there is going to be a substantial pickup in restructuring work from September. I don't think it will have to wait till next year. There's been a large deferment of the problem, I think that both Austin and I were looking at, and I think you were as well, Nick, at lens and at positions pre-COVID-19, where we thought some form of intervention was required. Now, having gone back to those referrers or those mandates, the feedback we're getting is, oh no, it's okay now, which is surprising given that everyone says trading conditions are worse under COVID-19 than they were before. So you've got to ask that there's a degree of artificiality created by the moratoria, etc. And I think when it does come off, that there's going to be a bit of a flood, if not a tsunami. At least it's going to be a flood, I think.
What you're saying here kind of ties in. I've put a bit of a mishmash of headlines together here. How Target got stuck in the middle as a retailer, so it was stuck in the middle strategy there. We've also got some headlines about Hertz. One of the headlines there says that Hertz was in a bad way before Corona hit, and there's another one there talking about Hertz's fleet. And you can see all of those cars piled up there are eating their heads off in terms of cost. And I just wonder when you think about as I said, Arnie, you were saying that there's a lot of sick businesses before Corona hit, and I guess maybe they got the sugar rush of some of these moratoriums and JobKeepers and what have you. But I'm actually wondering about Virgin. They're saying that one of the front runners on the bid for Virgin is talking about taking a middle of the road strategy between full service and budget. Now this here talks about superannuation coming up with negative returns. Now, I know that lately the stock market's been going great guns, but when the GFC came, a lot of people that were retiring all of a sudden had to go back to work. And Mark, I'm thinking about in your sector, a lot of your business sale transactions would be people who are looking to retire and succession planning and all that sort of stuff. I mean, do you think that a lot of people are going to be working until they're a lot older because of this?
Well, I mean, the first comment I make is that a lot of these super funds haven't been outperforming the benchmark of the market, and they've been charging good fees to do a mediocre result. We certainly saw during the GFC a lot of baby boomers holding on to businesses because they'd lost money, whether it was in their super or whatnot through trading. Hold on to their businesses. We have for the last couple of years starting to see some of those businesses hit the market, and now I do wonder whether they're going to hold on longer. But it's a supply and demand situation in any marketplace, and the longer they hold on, the more they're going to be faced with a flood of supply further down the track. So I anticipate that those baby boomers that were thinking about it 10 years ago and haven't done it since need to be moving at a point sooner rather than later, and accepting market value, not trying to hit for the breaches, because a lot of them they don't get to enjoy the fruits of their labour once they do sell if they're too old, really.
I know that I've had friends that have potentially been selling their business in the last few years, and because I saw what happened in the GFC and before that, I said, just take the offers. Don't hang in there for the ultimate offer, because there will be an event, and then all of a sudden you'll be 5 or 10 years behind schedule, and that's what we've seen. Arnie, we've only got a couple of minutes left. I'll just give the last word to you on that subject. Do you get involved much in just regular everyday buying and selling of businesses, and do you think a lot of people will be putting off their retirements?
I don't feel entirely qualified to make a prediction about that issue. My tracking of where markets are and where funds return and outperform benchmarks, all that is confined to my role as a director of companies which have investments in the marketplace. In my working life, the two big events that come to mind are 9/11 and, of course, the GFC. And the market has followed a reasonably predictable recovery after both those events. I'm sure that there'll be pluses and minuses going forward.
Certainly, the events that you mentioned, 9/11, and then the GFC. All of a sudden, insolvency practitioners that you thought had retired 5 years ago were suddenly putting on the boots again and running out. So we'll see if any of that happens. All right. Well, look, we are timing out. So what I'll do is I'll thank our guest today. I'm Arnie Narayan from Adelaide. It's been good. At least electronically, we can cross the borders while you're sorting out those special conditions and essential workers and all that sort of stuff. And Mark, thank you very much for joining us. It's been very good. It's great to have your insights as well. So I'll just say and what I will finish up on is saying is thank you to our viewers and our listeners. We are a podcast, so you can catch us on Apple and Google and Spotify and all of that sort of stuff. So thank you very much, Arnie and Mark, and thank you to everybody at home for watching. Cheers.